Hopefully this afternoon, you're in here for a session on accessibility. If you wanted something other than accessibility, then you're in the wrong room. I'd very much like to thank the sponsors who've made today possible, and I hope that today you've all benefited from the conference. Next to me is my fabulous sign language interpreter, Christy. I've asked Christy to come and to sign for me today because I think it's important for a number of reasons. I don't know if anyone here is hearing impaired. However, there could be. As this presentation is being videotaped, it's going to be available online, and we've got no idea what the needs are of the users that are going to be watching that. So it's important, and that's something that we're going to be discussing a little bit more about the importance of everybody. My name is Vivienne Conway, and I'm the director of WCAG IT. We're accessibility consultants, and that's all that we do. And believe me, that's a big job on its own. I'd prefer that you don't try to take a lot of notes today. I've intentionally made these slides quite text-heavy for a reason, because they are going to be available. There's a lot of links. There's a lot of information in the slides. I'll be talking to them, not reading them. But I want you to be able to access this information and to go and do some research yourself and to just see what you think of the field of accessibility. Why do we label people as having disabilities? Or even worse, why do we talk about disabled people? Today I want to challenge your thinking. I want you to completely change the way you think, how you view the work you do, and the services that you're providing. A thought. People don't have disabilities. Every person has a unique set of capabilities or abilities. It's us who disable people by putting obstacles in their path. So hold on to that thought. You can see here a list of the things that I'm thinking, hoping to cover today. But most importantly, my purpose today is to challenge your current thinking. I want to inspire you to create for inclusivity. I want you to understand what digital accessibility is all about. And I want to help good developers become great developers. When we look at the reasons why people start to address accessibility, there's three main reasons that come up. First of all, people think, well, it's the right thing to do. It's the moral high ground. It's a good thing to do. Other people think it's the smart thing to do. They want to get the extra customers into their business or into their website that they feel that they've been missing up to now. Some people would say that you could skip the first two of these two reasons, the fact that it's the right thing to do and the smart thing to do, but that you can't skip the third one, that it's the law. I would say that you can actually, if you wanted, you could skip all three of these, but it would be at your company's peril. The disability sector is going through a lot of review at the moment, and people with disabilities are becoming more and more aware of their rights, of their equal rights to access for information. Litigation for violation of accessibilities is increasing in Australia. It is law. You can be sued. We don't want you to be, and we don't want to use a stick. That's not the whole idea. We would like you to buy into the ideas of accessibility because you want to do it, and that's important. In the next section we're going to be looking at is actually what the requirements are. And it's kind of funny because I know that you guys want to know this, because when you were voting for presentations, there was a couple of presentations that I proposed, and one sounded really, really fun. It was about accessibility, but it was a lot more fun. You guys voted to know what the requirements are for you. And I think that's important to know, is that developers want to know what you should be doing and how to do it. In Australia, across Australia, there's federal government requirements, and it came in with something called the National Transition Strategy. Now, each of the states bought into the requirements, and each of them set up different dates and different levels that they would meet each of the dates. The Australian federal government mandated that all of their websites were to be compliant to what we'll call WCAG, and I'll get back to that in a minute, by December 2014. Can you guess how many actually were? Absolutely zero. Even the main federal governments who were putting forth the legislation. One thing is for certain, not meeting WCAG 2 to level AA will leave you at risk. There were some questions in the last session about risk. You will be at risk if you do not meet these guidelines. The guidelines, as I mentioned, are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they're currently at version 2.0. Now, these guidelines are the child of the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. These are the people that make standards. Your HTML, etc., is all your accessibility guidelines. They all come through W3C, which is a member organization. Now, an important thing to note is that WCAG 2 to level AA has now become an ISO standard. So organizations that are not familiar with WCAG and W3C, they do understand ISO. And that's the reason why it was adopted as an ISO standard. Many of you provide development work for organizations who spend a lot of time and money making sure their organizations are ISO compliant in other areas. For example, their policies, their procedures, their OC health and safety, their finances. They spend a lot of money being in compliance with standards. One thing is for certain that they understand ISO, but they don't know that there is an ISO standard that applies to accessibility. That ISO standard is WCAG 2 to AA. You don't have to buy that ISO standard. You can download WCAG 2 and see it with no cost whatsoever, because ISO standards are expensive. So who and what is covered by the guidelines? First of all, your internet connection, that's covered by the guidelines. Your intranet, so internally, so it's not just the external stuff facing to the public, it's what's facing your staff as well. And we'll be looking at that as to why that is in just a minute, but that's covered as well. Also your extranets, any supplier connections that you have. Any documents that you need an internet connection to download are covered by this. So anything you need an internet connection to get is covered by them, including your email. So say goodbye to the pretty pink signature line that you've been using. Not going to work. So who needs to be compliant? Is this just for government? Is this just something that, federal government have to do this, but nobody else? No, that's not the case. The case is every individual and organization that has digital material that has a base in Australia is covered by Australia's regulations. These are international regulations. There's almost nowhere in the world that doesn't require these guidelines to be met. So everybody from Joe's Garage to the Prime Minister is covered by them. Have you ever used a website that's really, really unfriendly? Tried to find specific content and you couldn't? If you had a physical shop, would you hide one of your products behind something? No, of course not. That would be stupid. You wouldn't expect to be able to sell it if you hid it, would you? So you want to make sure that your customers are able to reach your content. It only takes one unhappy customer to report you to the Australian Human Rights Commission. Believe me, having a complaint against you for human rights violation is not really a very good career move. It only takes one of these customers to tell all their friends that they couldn't use your website. Again, not a great idea. The Australian Human Rights Commission administers the Disability Discrimination Act. It's the Disability Discrimination Act that you can get sued under. That is the legislation that covers it. Most people, as I said, think that this only applies to government, and this isn't new news. These requirements have been there since July 1st, 2010 is where we first started bringing this in. So it's been around for a while. And the Australian Human Rights Commission are the ones that administer the Act. So they decide whether you will be sued. We don't have an adversarial type of system the way they do in the United States. If somebody has a problem with your website there, they simply sue you, and a lot of that is funded by the American Federation for the Blind, who have very deep pockets. Here we have more of a mediated approach. So if somebody has a problem with your website, they come to you and they say, I'm having a problem with your website. If you fix it, problem solved. If you don't and refuse to, then they can go to the Australian Human Rights Commission and they can make a complaint against you. The Australian Human Rights Commission will then come to you and say, hey, listen, you've had a complaint from a user. They're having problems accessing your website. What are you going to do about it? If you say, tough luck, don't care, then off you go to court. What they will do is they will give the person leave to sue you civilly, and they will assist them where it looks like a good case. And we'll be coming up with one of those good cases very shortly. Oh, I'll go back to that slide for 1 second. Important thing to note, and the reason why I put this particular slide in, is notice the comment. Let me see if this works. Yes, here we are. This requirement applies to any individual or organization developing a website. So nobody gets a get-out-of-jail-free card on this one. So as I mentioned, they administer the guidelines. They advise you to get expert advice. So it's one of these things that when I talk about accessibility, I remind people that if I'm driving in my car down the road at 200 kilometers an hour, and the policeman pulls me over, provided he could catch me, and he says, why were you driving so fast? And if I say, well, I didn't know that that was the speed limit, do you think he's going to care that I say that? No, it's my obligation as the driver of a vehicle to know the laws that apply. It's your obligation, if you have a website or are developing a website, to know the law. Same thing, ignorance is no excuse. So make sure that you get help. We advise organizations that it's a good idea to get a baseline audit of a website so that before, even if you're going to redevelop the website or do some changes, find out what's the matter with the current one before you start to make changes. Get that baseline audit done. Then if you're going to develop a new website, you know what things not to mess up again. While you're about it, don't forget about testing with people with disabilities. And remember seniors. Not all seniors are going to be comfortable with all websites. Something that you've got to plan for. Policy is changing. People with disabilities are becoming more and more aware of what their rights are. Disability organizations are getting this information out. The Australian government, state governments, all organizations are telling people with disabilities that if you have problems with a digital resource, you need to tell the owner of that resource that it doesn't work for you. Give them the opportunity to fix it. So if I've had a complaint go to the Australian Human Rights Commission, once it hits the Australian Human Rights Commission, I can't change my mind, go to that user and say, oh, I've decided to fix it after all. It's too late then because I can't talk to the user anymore. The Human Rights Commission takes that over. I'm now paying at least a QC rate to defend myself and make sure whatever I've done to fix it is going to be okay. So if somebody comes to you and says, this doesn't work for me with my particular assistive technology needs, fix it now. It's going to be a whole lot less expensive than paying lawyers. This is your opportunity to stand out from the crowd. The trend is now to embed accessibility requirements in an organization's disability access and inclusion plan. You'll find every level of government will have one of these. It's called a DAPE, Disability Access and Inclusion Plan. In there, there is an area about information, the availability of information to people, and the availability of digital information. So this is where it's covered in most government departments. If you're, as developers, doing work for government departments, this is often where this question will start to be addressed from. This is where you as developers enter the arena. You're going to be asked to develop new digital materials to meet these accessibility requirements. Can you do it? Do you know what the requirements are? Governments have now, just as of January 1st, we have now introduced an Australian standard. Up to now, we've had to rely on Australian human rights, administering the DDA, but we now have something that we can kind of short-circuit that legal process a little bit. It's called Australian Standard AS 301549. And you can tell I've got that one memorized. I've said it so many times. Now, what that means is it's the European standard of 301549, so EN 301549. We've adopted it as Australia, lock, stock, and barrel. We've got the whole thing, we've brought it in, and we're going to make any changes we need over time, rather than to take 4 years with a government bureaucracy department to write a new standard. So we've adopted the European one because it works. And so what will happen is that organizations can embed this Australian standard in their tendering documents. So if you're going to respond to a tender to develop some digital materials, you will now start seeing must provide compliance statement with AS 301549. That is WCAG 2 to level AA. Keep hearing that same thing, don't you? They're putting it everywhere so that it gets through. That is the standard that you must meet. So it's not just governments, though, that can use it. If anybody, even as an individual or as a company, wants to make sure that what they pay for is accessible, they can embed that statement into their tendering documents and say that we will require a statement of compliance. So that means you're going to have some examples, aren't you, to prove that you can do accessible work. You will not get federal government work. They are not allowed to give a tender to anybody that does not complete a satisfactory statement of compliance with AS 301549. So if you're a developer, you better start reading on this and find out about it. State governments are putting that in their tender documents too, and so are local governments. Everyone I work for, I'm telling, make sure that's in there, because that gives them a legal standing to hold you to account that what you're giving them is accessible. I was talking just recently with an organization that provides employment for people with disabilities. They had paid a huge amount of money to somebody to create a website for them that was to be compliant with WCAG 2 to level AA. And one of my staff members was down there doing some physical auditing for, because she's blind, for their premises. And she looked at their website and she said, anybody ever told you that your website's not accessible? It's kind of bad for an accessibility organization. I said, well, we just paid a fortune to have this website done. There was no legal recourse for them. They had put in there that they wanted it to be compliant, but they had no standard to relate to. If they had put in that compliance statement about AS 301549, it's the developer who would have borne the extra cost of having it fixed. They just said, sure, we can do a website to WCAG 2 AA. Didn't mean they were going to, but they could. So make sure that you understand what those guidelines are. Time to change our thinking, but it's not going to be easy. So I'm going to be looking here at a little bit of data for you. On the 2011 census, not the one just recently that we messed up so badly, the previous one, 20% of the population registered as having a disability that in some way affected their education, their mobility, or their employment. That's 20%. It was almost 20%. That's 1 in 5. However, that's the tip of the iceberg. Because if I'm slightly dyslexic, I probably wouldn't have said I had a disability. If I have epilepsy, but because of the social stigma that's attached to it, I didn't want to put that down, I'm not in there. I mean, after all, it's been 10 years since I had a seizure, I wouldn't consider that. However, if your website's flashing at me, it might provoke one. But consider the people who have multiple low-level disabilities. So say I'm getting a little bit older, English is my second language, and I've got a bit of a shake to my hand, so I find small links hard to use. I'm not in that data. If I simply am not comfortable using a mouse, hand stuff, not in that data. If, as I said, numerous things, so my eyesight's not so great, or certain things I find difficulty with concentrating, or I'm just, a little bit dyslexic, I often think I am, I'm not in that at all. It's actually closer to 50% of the population require some accessibility considerations in a website. Can you afford to disregard almost half of your users? Probably not. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that when you look at two websites, very, very similar in appearance, one will be accessible and one won't. 100% of people, if asked, will choose the accessible version. Why? Simple design, elegant, things work. Lovely to have buttons, but if they don't tell you what they are when you're tabbing through it, what good is it? I've tabbed through many forms and it says edit blank. Wonderful. What do I put in there? It hasn't told me. If you can't see the word name, you don't know that that's a label if you haven't coded it properly, which will bring us to something about best practice coding that we'll look at in just a minute. There's a famous quote, "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everybody, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." It's a very, very famous quote by Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Please note both who said it and the fact that it brings our focus to one of the most important aspects of the web. Access by everyone is an essential component. Part of why it was developed. So if you're not trying to design for everybody, you're missing one of the important aspects. I love this picture. Are good intentions good enough? In the physical sense, we can see how ridiculous this wheelchair ramp is. The assumption is made, obviously, that people with wheelchairs have somebody that can help them over the lip. But I mean, why do it in the first place? It's completely stupid. Have you ever seen wheelchair basketball players? Do you think one of them wants you to help them over the lip of the wheelchair ramp? If you do a search in your favorite search engine and look at failed wheelchair ramps, you will see some of the most ridiculous pictures you've ever seen anywhere. Slopes that just make you go dizzy at the thought of even trying to get down them, let alone in a wheelchair. So thinking about the relationship to the physical and the digital, are our assumptions for digital accessibility based on laziness, ignorance, or what? Why aren't we meeting the accessibility guidelines? Why aren't we designing accessibly? There's a problem, isn't there? So who does accessibility actually benefit? As I mentioned, everybody really benefits from a more accessible website. But besides people with disabilities, there's older users, people with mobile phones. Have you ever tried to fill out a PDF document on your phone on the train? Forget it. It's not going to work very well, is it? People living in areas with lower bandwidth. So if there's a document that they need to download and it hasn't told them how big it is and how long it's going to take, they might prefer to download that later on after they're finished rather than to hang everything up waiting for it now. The simple matter in the link of saying how big the document is. Not rocket science. In some areas, approximately 12.5% of the population are over the age of 60, based on this previous census data again. And 18% of the residents in one of the local communities that I was working with come from countries where English is not their first language. And you think, oh, okay, well, you know, English is our first language, you know. Do we need to do that? Do we care about our users? Yes, we do. Did you know that if you use the abbreviation PH space NO for a phone number, which is really, really common, it's pronounced through a screen reader as FANO. Now, if you have English as a second language and you're listening on a screen reader, would you know what it wanted when it asked for your FANO? Probably not. I'd have trouble with that one. How does business benefit from accessibility? First of all, you can boost your user base by that at least 20% that I mentioned. The work that you do on incorporating accessibility should more than pay for itself. We're not asking you to spend a lot of money, or an organization to spend a lot of money, that there isn't a decent return on investment for. People who embrace accessibility seldom embrace it for the return on the investment. Normally, they're wanting to do the right thing. But it's important to know, because they're shareholders as well, that there is a return on investment. And if you spend this money on designing accessibly, more people are actually going to use your website. Existing users are likely to be a whole lot more loyal. It's wonderful public relations. There is nothing the matter in advertising the fact that you have consulted and worked with people with disabilities to make sure that your website is inclusive of all of our society. Advertise it, scream it from the rooftops. People with disabilities are not going to mind. They would like to know who's invested the money in accessibility. It shows that you're public spirited. You've all heard the corporate social responsibility terms. This is an essential aspect of it, is the fact that you care about all your users. Really important. How many times have the people who employ you asked you how they can make sure that their website comes up on the first page of a Google search? One of those most common questions people ask. I want to come up higher in the list. How can I do that? Incorporating accessibility principles into your design will boost your search engine optimization. So think about things like heading structure, keywords, search features, site maps. They will all improve your search engine optimization. You can also embed information in the metadata that describes that this website is WCAG 2 AA compliant. Top of the list. So, as I mentioned, organizations in Australia spend huge amounts of money on financial compliance, but seldom spend anything at all on accessibility compliance. They don't hesitate to make sure that their physical premises are accessible. Can you imagine having an architect design a building for you that didn't have wheelchair access, that didn't have doors wide enough to get a wheelchair through, that didn't have toilets for people that need disability assistance? You would never be allowed to open the doors, would you? Yet most of our business is coming through our digital shop fronts, and we're not making sure that people can get through the door. Start to think about the digital accessibility as the digital equivalent of a wheelchair ramp. You all understand the need for a wheelchair ramp, so start to grasp the importance of digital accessibility. Are you understanding yet that there are lots of benefits in designing accessibly? There's tons. The benefits are both to you and to the website owner. If you know how to develop accessibly and you've got proof that you can, you're a whole lot more marketable than the person who hasn't done anything. The person who hasn't done anything is not going to be able to work on government projects. We recently did a project for a local government group, and they asked us to be on their tender panel to help them select the successful tenderer, because accessibility was a key component they wanted. And so when it got down to the final three, they said, okay, Vivienne, you're going to ask the difficult questions because we want them to get mad at you, not us, because we have to work with them. So they were all asked for 3 examples of websites that they had created that met WCAG 2 to level AA. So the organization gave me the 3 examples. You know, not one of them even got to single A, and not by a country mile. So how could they say they were accessible when they weren't? They just thought, well, we do good work, it must be. That's all I can think of, is that they actually thought they were, rather than telling complete lies. And then, just for fun, I decided to look at the company's own websites as well. They were even worse. There was no accessibility provision in there, yet they were planning to tender for work that was accessible. We ended up choosing an organization that looked like it would be the best to work with, that would take on board what we said, that would learn and grow and be able to produce accessible work. But we're talking about Perth, and we could not find developers that could do what needed to be done. And I'd say that's a problem. So make yourself more marketable. Show that you can have examples for your clients that are accessible. So what actually happens if you decide to do nothing? First of all, you better understand the risks. You've got the loss of website traffic to your website, risk of litigation, the loss of respect of your customers. Users will go to a company that has a more accessible website. So if you think of banking, now everybody who's working, receiving a pension or anything else, needs to have a bank account now, don't they? Nobody gets a cash pay packet at the end of the week. So people with disabilities, this minimum 20% of the population, will open the bank account with the website that works best for them. That's how they're going to choose. Whether or not they get 0.25% more or less is not going to be the deciding point on their decision. Because what good is that 0.25% if they can't use the website? We've probably all seen bank websites where in order to log in, they've got one of those rotating keypads that every time you go to it, the keys are in a different position. Now, I tried to test one of those with a screen reader, and I wanted to throw my computer out the window because I could go to the first button and I could click it for my first number, but it wouldn't let me put in my second number because I had clicked something and I had to press submit. But if I press submit, I haven't put in the other 3 numbers I needed. And I had this vicious circle going around, and my computer came that close to going through the window. But the funny thing is when I called the bank to complain about that, the person who answered the help said, well, actually, I'm a person with a disability. I'm in a wheelchair. But he hadn't thought that he had a physical disability, but his thinking hadn't gone beyond that to people with different disabilities. It's important to check things, not just technical compliance checklists. It's important to test things with people with disabilities so you've got a good, well-rounded view about how accessible your product is. I'm going to show you a few examples coming up, and hopefully you'll start to get a bit more of an idea. Don't you love this wheelchair ramp? One of the best I've seen. Really, are you kidding me? Can you just hear everybody sitting, the lawyers for the 2 sides, the property owner and the person who's just headed into the creek there, slogging it out in court? This is ridiculous, isn't it? The only people who would have fun with it is somebody who might be into wheelchair extreme sports. And even then, I'd be wondering about them. Here's another one. It's not just the steps, the ridiculously steep slopes of the ramps. The crazy thing here is that the sign is in the middle of the ramp. If I need a wheelchair ramp, do you think I can get out of my chair to move the sign? Probably not. So what were they thinking? I approached the building having been told that, there's a wheelchair ramp, but I can't use it. You think you've done the right thing in the design of your product. Can people use it? Have you tested it? This, to us, makes perfect sense that it's absolutely ridiculous. The person with the wheelchair approaching that business can't get in. So how difficult would it have been to say, write the sign on the ramp? Put a sign off to the side somewhere that it's for wheelchair access? But the reality is if you saw a ramp, wouldn't you know it was for wheelchairs? I'm not saying somebody else can't use it, but that's just completely ridiculous, isn't it? A lot of the things that we do in our website design are just as ridiculous. What good is having a button to submit a form if it doesn't tell you what the button is for? The screen reader user will hear button. Brilliant. What do I do with it? Is it submit? Is it go back? Is it go? What if there's 3 buttons and they all say button, button, button? I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to leave your website. I'm going to look at a few examples with the permission of Disability Services Commission. This is some work they did on one of their websites a few years ago. There's some really important principles. There's about 6 principles here that I'd like you to watch. As I said, you'll be able to have access to all of this later. They worked really hard on making sure that they had some good design principles in here. First thing is that they've got a skip link. Go to main content, up there at number 1. Now, it is a requirement that you either have a good heading structure or a skip link or some way to bypass repeated navigational elements. I was looking at a website yesterday. In order to get to the main content, I would have had to hit my tab key 147 times. The sad thing is that even if I had passed a skip link that was there, Once I think, oh, well, you know, it's probably just a couple of tabs because you just see the top level, but it actually made me go through every single sub-level. Escape wouldn't work. No key would work to get out of it. I either had to close the website, in which case I'm unlikely to come back, or I had to tab all the way through. You should at least be able to get out of it, shouldn't you? Escape key being actioned for that would have done the trick. But it made me go all the way through. So if you have a skip link that is visible up at the top all the time, the user can just go Control Home. I can use a skip link to get past all of this. Easy done. The next one, clear focus. At number 2, you'll notice that where the keyboard focus is and the mouse focus, which should be the same, they have changed the background. So even if I'm colorblind or I have low vision, that's really easy to see the focus indicator of, isn't it? On this particular website, down at the bottom here, there's support for a whole bunch of different languages. Now, as developers, what you're going to need to do if you're asked to put something like this in, is make sure that you're using your HTML language element to identify the language for each section. There's nothing worse than hearing a Vietnamese person's screen reader trying to read French or Italian or something else. It comes out really, really weird. So the screen reader needs to be told what language the section is in. They decided to do this rather than to use the Google Translate. Google Translate itself is not accessible. So if you're putting in widgets of things that are third-party products that are not accessible, be aware that you will be held liable, and it will happen in Australia very quickly as soon as somebody decides to test it, for all third-party content on your website. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. A lot of developers think, well, it's third-party, I can't fix it, therefore I'm not responsible. If you host it on your website, you will be held responsible. Massive grocery chain in the US just got sued for this. They were using American Express for the payment portal and Google Maps for their store locators, neither of which are accessible in their standard form. They have to be fixed. So they were held liable for that. The next item is event warnings. Now, you'll notice just here that it says email this page, new email window will open. That's not hard to do, is it? If it's a document, tell them what format it is and how big it is. Sufficient color contrast is important. Control over the media is important. Can everybody use what you create? In the Coles case, it was all about the user journey. Now, Coles were taken to court. The user wanted to use the Coles website, and it didn't work. They had done a refresh. They had broken the delivery button and the payment button. So they could spend all their time putting the groceries into their cart, but they could neither organize delivery or payment. The user contacted them, asked them to fix it. They decided to ignore the user completely. And so she went to Australian Human Rights, lodged a complaint. It was in all the media. Coles refused to fix it for the Australian Human Rights Commission, even though they were told that they would probably be sued. It ended up in court. Coles decided to settle out of court for an undisclosed sum of money and promised to make sure the website was made accessible and never to do that again. But they still had to fix it. It's not an either-or. How much effort are you going to put into making what you develop accessible? Are you starting to see that it's actually worth the effort that you put in? Think about things like keyboard accessibility, screen reader accessibility, sufficient color contrast for those who are colorblind, not having flickering content which might provoke seizures, making sure content doesn't move without controls. Links need to make sense in context and out of context. In this particular example, if you asked for a list of links, which is what you would get there on the left, and you heard IMG1, you think you're going to action that link? No, because you don't know where you're going. In this example here, all of the links have the same text. Government Gazette WA. Wonderful. Which one do you want? If you wanted the one for July 2008, you're going to have to listen to the whole table until you hear that date. User's not going to do that. People need to be able to enlarge the text. You need, with WCAG 2, you need to be able to enlarge text 200% so you don't lose functionality or visibility of it. In this case, the carrots or the container was made with a fixed size rather than relative, so it didn't move to accommodate the larger text. In the next iteration of WCAG, which is 2.1, the requirement's actually 400%. In other words, stop using fixed sizes. Look at the color contrast here. Even with good vision, that's hard to see, isn't it? And then there's a gradient. It's almost unusable for everybody. What about this example? If you're one of the 1 in 10 men in the world are colorblind, you're not going to be able to use that. But that's not the only situation. The fact is if I've got a screen reader, blind or low vision, how do I get that information about where that block is? We need to have some alternative text content, don't we? So that we can describe for the user where that is. Don't assume that people with disabilities don't purchase products, buy cars, take holidays, all the rest of it. They do. In this example, you can see some of the colors the same, so you can probably figure out where that came from. There's been no alternative text applied to any of those images. So all the person would hear would be either image and nothing, or image and a URL that we all know some of them that can go on for lines and lines. They aren't going to use it. It's not going to tell them anything. Images that have information or convey feeling must have alternative text describing to people what it is. If you're putting video on, make sure there are text transcripts, make sure there are captions, preferably make sure you've got sign language. Okay? What we've got today, because Christy is signing for me today, when the video goes together, this signer will be available on the top corner of the video. So people that are deaf are going to be able to get the information at the same time. Why do you think there aren't a lot of deaf people going to conferences? How are they going to get the information? So deaf people are going to actually be able to use this video and get the information, but we should be catering for that. We should be having more things signed because everybody matters. We need you to be an accessible developer. We need you to make a difference. You will get selected for assignments because of your ability to create inclusive websites. Don't you think it's time to stand out from the crowd? We're often asked to help organizations pick a developer. Our advice to you is to have evidence of your ability, your capability to do an accessible website. Show people that you know how to do it. Be ready to show prospective clients. Better yet, have your evidence tested. So when they look at it, you can say, actually, I've had this verified that this is accessible. Wouldn't that tell a lot to your customer about how you value accessibility? There's a few common pitfalls. One of them is people saying they can do things they can't. If you can't do it or you don't have the experience, then tell your customers. Don't say it's completely compliant when it isn't, but you might want to tell them that you will work to make sure that everything is compliant no matter how hard that is. That's going to show that can-do attitude. That would have helped us when we were choosing a developer. Please don't fall into the trap of using automated tools. And some of you that were in the session on mobile testing might have heard me be a little mouthy about that. Automated tools will never replace human beings. Okay? Please don't fall into the trap of relying on those. Watch out for third-party content. There's some challenges ahead of you, and nobody can deny that. Design so that everyone possible can use the great digital product that you've created. Design for accessibility. Using personas, checking with experts, those will all help you. Accept the challenge. Embrace the challenges that are ahead of you. Make sure you're designing for accessibility. Remember, people don't have disabilities. They all have capabilities. We're the ones that disable them by putting obstacles in their path. Bit by bit, we can make a difference by removing the obstacles. Accessibility matters. Let's unlock the web. Thank you.